Good afternoon, everybody. All right, there we go. My name is Dan Weisberg. I'm the CEO of TNTP. Welcome to our strategy session on the teacher shortage, myths, realities, solutions, and really interesting war stories. So I'm going to turn it over to really an excellent set of panelists in just a minute. Let me do very brief introductions so you know who they are. I'm not going to read their bios because you have that in your materials, but I really am excited about this panel. So to my immediate left, we have Dan Goldhaber, who's the director of the Calder Center at University of Washington, which does probably the most powerful and actionable research in the education field of anybody. We have Kate Walsh, who's the president of the National Council on Teacher Quality, probably more impact on state policy than any other organization in the field. Elisa Villanueva Beard, who leads a little organization called Teach for America. I'm not sure if you've heard of them. Yes, still the wellspring of talent for the entire movement. Thank you, Elisa. And Kim Wagner, who is the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education in Rhode Island. And I would say, no disrespect to the other state chiefs, but is doing some of the most influential and innovative work on state policy in the entire country. So, great panel. We're here to talk about teacher shortages. First, we should start with bedrock fact that teachers remain the most powerful school-based factor in student success. But the reality is that we don't provide kids the talent they need, not even close, and we haven't done it for many decades at this point. I want to be clear that the shortages that exist in teacher talent have huge consequences for kids. So think about it. Right here in Metro Nashville, I don't mean to pick on our hosts here, but I believe it was reported in the press they opened the school year with about 140 teacher vacancies. So think about that. Your child, your grandchild, your niece, your nephew goes to school, comes back and tells you that they've got a substitute for the first 3 months of the school year for third grade. Anybody okay with that? Raise your hand if that's an okay outcome for our kids. I don't think so. Or they're taking high school biology with a teacher who wasn't trained to teach biology and doesn't have really any content knowledge about biology. That's not okay. Real consequences for kids. But on the flip side, this is an issue. This is not one of these big existential questions that we really don't have any idea how to solve. This is actually an issue which you'll hear from our panelists. There are states, there are districts, there are charter management organizations that are actually doing some innovative things that are really helping to address the shortages in talent that exist out there. And this is something that we can do in the short term. So what I hope is you will leave after this session, particularly those of you who are policymakers and advocates at the state and local level, with some real ideas, some real tools to go back to your home states, to your home counties and regions to really address this problem, which is a real one. So what's going to happen? Little flow of the day or flow of the afternoon. Each of our panelists is going to talk for about 5 to 7 minutes just to kind of frame the issue and give us a hint of their expertise on this issue. Then I'm going to ask them some questions, hope to spark some debate, be provocative, and then we'll turn it over to you all. And we have at least one mic up here, and I will prompt you, those of you who have questions for our panelists, to line up at the mic when we get to that point. Okay, so without further ado, let me turn it over to Dan.
And Dan is making sure that he actually has the clicker in his pocket, which he does. All right. Don't call my 7 minutes started yet. Can you pass this over?
Yes.
Or perhaps at 10 minutes.
All right, so it's nice to see you all. And I'm coming over here so I can talk through a couple of slides, which incidentally you have in the back. We were told to bring about 250 of them. I'm not sure there are 250 people here, but you know, the holidays are coming up. It's good reading. Okay, so I'm here to say that we have a terrible, terrible national teacher shortage crisis. Terrible. This is a picture from a recent report that was written up in the newspapers all across the country. And if you stare closely at it, it suggests that we're going to be short about 100,000 teachers in 2018, which is obviously right around the corner. And then coincidentally, a friend of mine emailed me some headlines that appeared in Michigan. I'm just going to read a couple of these. From the Lansing State Journal, many school boards will face teacher shortages because of small pay. From the Battle Creek Inquirer, teacher shortages alarm instructors. And from the Detroit Free Press, teachers, there'll be too few to go around if action isn't taken soon. So here's the thing. Those headlines were from 1920, 1950 or 55, I don't remember, and 1986. And the point is that we've kind of been here before. In fact, if you look at media mentions, if left is going to be the left side of the screen. If you looked at media mentions of teacher shortage, it looks like it runs cyclical with the economy. So when the unemployment rate is high, teacher shortages are not an issue. When the unemployment rate is low, there are lots of stories about teacher shortages. This is kind of the story that, to my mind, kicked it off. It's from the New York Times by Motoko Rich. It was from 2015. And she had this figure about the number of graduates from California schools of education and the steep drop-off in the number of people that were graduating and getting credentialed. So what I want to do is give you kind of the national picture, because this picture ran from 2008 to 2012. So this is the national picture of new degrees from 2008 to 2012, if I cut it off. And you could see that there's beginning to be a little bit of a dip. But thanks to Drew back there, thank you, Drew, we're going to go back in time, I think. So if you kind of scroll back in time at the number of degrees, you can see that, yes, there has been a little bit of a dip, but the number of people who are graduating with a degree in education today is roughly what it was in the early mid-2000s. So it's not like the country has actually fallen off a cliff. So I was joking, if you can't tell. I don't think that we have a national teacher shortage crisis. And I think that kind of framing, where we talk about teachers generically, is really problematic to moving to solutions to areas where there are real problems. So I want to sort of transition you to that now, because there are real problems. But just to kind of put a fine point on this issue. And again, you've got these in your slides and the sources and all the details. But in selected years, there's a national survey of school systems. And that's what these blue bars are, is the responses by the school systems about how many teachers that they are hiring, how difficult it is to find people to fill certain kinds of slots. And so what you can see is the number of new to the profession teachers that are hired in every year is exceeded by the number of people who are graduating with a degree suggesting they want to teach by 100, 150, almost 200,000 in some years. So again, I just want to kind of put aside the message that there's a national teacher shortage. Wrong framing. There is no national teacher labor market. In fact, it's hard theoretically to even define exactly what teacher shortage means. There's a federal definition, but it's not defined in the way that an economist would define it. All right, so where are the real problems? Because there are real problems. So from that same survey, what these bars show is the difficulty that school systems face in selected years, 1991 all the way to 2011, 2012, in finding teachers in particular fields. So the important thing to know is that the blue is at the elementary level, and the green and purple are in special education and in STEM. And even in areas, even at times when there was all this message about a national shortage, and the last time where we sort of saw the kind of headlines that we're seeing today was around the dot-com bubble in the late 90s, the blue bar is smaller than any year of the green or purple bars, meaning that at any time we look, it has been really hard for school systems to staff special education and STEM areas, much harder than even the worst time it might have been to staff at the elementary level. So again, not generic, but problems. I mean, there are a lot of school systems that report difficulty. There are also difficulties for certain kinds of schools, right? So if you're a very high poverty school, that's the blue bars, versus a lower poverty school, those are the yellow bars, you tend to have much greater difficulty staffing school systems. How am I doing on time, Dan? Do I have a little more time?
You do.
All right. So I think that there are some things that can be done about this. There are some resources here that kind of frame this problem that I've taken a few minutes to talk with you about in more detail and with more empirical evidence. I'm an empirical guy, so I think we really need to get down to the facts and figures in order to get at this issue. But I'm going to not talk about some of the solutions that are listed up here. Instead, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, and she's going to launch us off in talking about some of these solutions.
I'm what's known as my good friend Linda Darling Hammond called me, a teacher shortage denier. And and it's not, and I say that with you know, not to insult or to deny the pain that many of you in this room might be feeling back home. As Dan said, there are very real shortages, but our contention is that these shortages were pretty pronounced 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 15 years ago. These are not new, but these shortages do come up in the national conversation because they play into a narrative that has other ulterior motives. And that's what I'd like to talk to you today about. So I'm going to give you one little data point that Dan didn't give you. If you look at the number of public school teachers in the United States, it's gone up by some 400,000 in the past few years. If you look at the student population over that time, that's been constant. So if we really had a shortage, it would be pretty difficult to be expanding the workforce, especially since the student population had not grown. Now, when I put this number up before, LPI, Learning Policy Institute, said that that's because they had to hire 100,000 uncertified people, and that 100,000 uncertified people also includes folks like Teach for America and other alternate routes. So it's not all about emergency credentialing hiring. We literally are expanding the workforce at the same time that we're screaming shortage. But both sides are right. So when I talk about feeding a particular narrative, the narrative of those who are pushing a national teacher shortage look for three solutions: raise salaries across the board, lower entry requirements to get into the profession, and improve working conditions. So if you go back to what Dan was saying about raising salaries, if we raise salaries across the board, which in fact we do need to do in many states in particular, such as anyone here from Oklahoma or North Carolina, those two states in particular, one of the reasons for their teacher shortages is they do not pay their teachers enough. So I'm not here to defend teacher salaries across the board, but I'm saying that if we raise salaries, that's not going to do much about the STEM shortages. A 5% raise in teacher salaries across the board is not going to get math and science teachers into the classroom. So the first solution is not a solution. The second one is genuinely upsetting to me, as we have worked so hard in the past 10 years to lower requirements to get into the profession. As I've said, probably some of you have heard me say it many times, teaching is often easier to get into than it is to qualify academically to play college football. They have higher standards. The NCAA has higher standards than many teacher prep programs in the United States. That has to change. But nevertheless, we're seeing a lot of states respond to this. A lot of state legislators are responding to this by saying, you know, those requirements that we just raised 5 years ago, we have to lower them down. But when you do that, think about the people you're not going to get. There have been surveys of talented college students who make A's and B's who say the reason they don't want to teach isn't because they don't want to be a teacher. It's because they don't want to do a low-status major that everybody else on campus can get into. And then finally, improve working conditions. What the heck that means? How is that a policy solution? I think it means don't test kids, but I'm not sure. So here, we're not going to spend any time on this. I'm happy to pass this slide along. Here are states that have made moves to lower their entry requirements. The exact opposite of what you should be doing. Think about all the talent, especially minority. A lot of times the response is you need to lower standards so more minorities can get into the teaching profession. One, if I were black, I don't even know how I would respond to that. It's so deeply insulting. But two, the notion that we don't understand that black talented college students don't have any more interest than white college students who are talented in entering a profession that is open to everyone and anyone, no matter what their grades are. Okay, so there are a number of policy solutions which you can pursue, which I think would be helpful for those of you who are in states or in areas where you need to address this problem. We have to reform teacher pay. There's no question about it. That includes raising base pay in many places, but we have to start differentiated pay. And there are only 3 states in the United States, Florida, New Mexico, and Utah, that have really gotten serious about this. I'm not saying their districts have gotten serious about it, but at the state level they have. State reciprocity. Do you know there is not a single state in this country that makes it relatively easy for someone to take their teacher license and move across a border? And if you go to your state education agency and you say, Kate Walsh says you're making it hard, they'll say, oh, no, it's really easy. It is one of the most difficult things there is to take your teacher license and move across a border. Asking teacher prep programs to start showing your production data. Do you have a lot of shortage areas, a lot of areas where you should be producing and you're not? Only one state in the country is flirting with this next solution, which is approving programs based on limits that you set for a certification area. We produce twice as many elementary teachers as we need in the United States. Why not encourage some of those young ladies to enter ELL or special ed, okay? Better data systems, we absolutely need those to track supply and demand and link it to districts' needs, and also recruiting in specific subject areas like UTeach does. So I'm going to stop there and move on. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Lisa, and folks standing in the back, I hate to see you standing. There's plenty of seats up here if you would rather sit.
All right. Good afternoon. It's great to be here with you all. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of Teach for America works across 35 states and Washington, D.C., and we've been around for 27 years. So from the perspective of what we've learned through that context. And I want to make 2 points on the supply that we have, and then I want to make a point, double down on diversity and touch on entry to criteria for licensure that you started to allude to, Kate. So the first thing I will say when we consider supply, I think we really have to ground ourselves in being attuned to this generation of young leaders who are graduating from college. Millennials and soon to be Gen Zs have just different interests and expectations that we've got to make sure that we're responding to if we're going to attract the next generation of incredible leaders. And my interest is attracting great people into this profession. A couple things that I would say about this. One is our millennials, and we study this a lot because the primary folks that we are recruiting are straight out of college, are keeping jobs at 5 years or less on average. And when they get right out of college, they're actually spending less than that amount of time in their first job. And so there are few professions that are saying, hey, you need to pick a profession and a career for the rest of your life. It's just not how this generation is oriented. And so we've got to think about how do we make this enticing where folks see what skills they are building that are transferable, where they're able to build a career and have real pipelines for advancement, which really matters. The other thing that I would say on this front is, you touched on this, Kate, folks are moving. People are more mobile now and transient than ever before. 25% of teachers will cross a state line, and there is no reciprocity. It's very difficult. It costs money. There's pensions, there's all these things, and it is a barrier to people staying in the profession. And so we've got to figure out how do we bring into today's times and allow and are responsive to how we are watching people behave in today's day and age. And the last thing I will say is, there's just a study that came out about millennials, and 74% of them say that they think all of education has to be reimagined. And they want to be part of an environment that is flexible, that nurtures curiosity and creativity and all of these things. And when they don't see that playing out in our schools, it's a real detriment to attracting them to the field. So that's on this generation and being responsive. The second thing I want to talk about is the role of alternative certification in our country. So 25% of teachers say that they entered the profession through an alternative route. Obviously, Teach for America is an alternative route. And a couple points to make on this. I think it's just really important that we put to bed the debate about whether one route is better than the other. There are great and terrible programs on the traditional side and on the alternatives for certification side. And there was just a new study that came out that, in fact, said that, again, what the research has said is that it bears out, it's almost no difference. This one said that alt-cert programs are slightly better. I'm proud that at Teach for America, we've consistently showed that we have a positive impact, especially in science and math and pre-K. And so the conversation hopefully should evolve rather than saying, focusing on those inputs, really focusing on getting data that allows teacher prep programs to focus on improvement, where are there gaps, and how do we get better and are held accountable to delivering on what we're supposed to for children every year. And just this debate is not over. We literally just had a massive battle, Teach for America and I guess alt-cert altogether in one state that was in their ESSA plan trying to put in there defining ineffective teachers as folks that come from alt-cert programs, which is just, really frustrating and not responsible in my view. The last point I'll make on alt-cert is, one of the gaps we haven't talked about yet of shortages is people of color. And today in our country, 51% of students in public schools are kids of color, and 18% of the teaching profession are people of color. And this really matters. Alt-cert programs are providing more diversity. If you look at all the graduates from alternative certification programs, 11% are Black, 15% are Latino. You look at traditional programs, it's 5 and 4 respectively. So that leads me to my last point, which is on diversity. And this is something that really matters to us at Teach for America because the majority of the communities that we place in serve kids of color, serve kids in low-income communities. And so I want to talk first about why this is important because I don't think not everyone buys that this actually is important. And there's two big thoughts here. One is it's just good for humankind. It is just good for us as we live in a more and more global society. It is a more diverse society than we can ever imagine, and learning how to work across lines of difference means that you're going to be an effective leader. Governor Bush alluded to this, building diverse coalitions actually means you have to know how to interact with people, not just from ideological standpoints, but people who come from different races and backgrounds. And there is research that shows that this decreases unconscious racial bias, and so all of these things things do matter, and our students, all students, benefit from having exposure to people who look different than them, and that this is really important. And if we're talking about innovations, which a lot of us are talking about these days, one of the enablers of innovation is divergent thinking, diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds, and so it just provides a very important, context to enable that. The second thing I will say is that the data is also just clear on how important this is for student achievement. Kids of color who have teachers who share their background do better as it pertains to student achievement. And there is research that is showing this, and more research that is supporting this. And I'll say two things about it. One is the power of perception, which you will find is that teachers of color have a higher estimations of students' academic ability, and that tends to play out with teachers of color who are teaching other teachers, kids of color. And then further, the perspective of just how behavior is interpreted. Some people see it disruptive, they see it as normal, and this does impact kids. And at the end of the day, which I think is our most interest here, is that kids just do better. There's less of a dropout rate, and they do better on standardized tests when they are taught by teachers of color, and that is how the data is bearing out. The last point that I will make on this is there's lots of levers we can consider when we think about how do you continue to diversify the teaching force. And one of the things we've thought a lot about at Teach for America is smart criteria for entry. And so we believe deeply in high quality. Last year we had 48,000 applications. We accepted 15% of them at Teach for America. We also have a teaching core that is almost 50% people of color, and a third are first generation college graduates, and we've been able to produce that for the last 3 years. And so we don't lower our bar, but we think holistically about admissions. And I think this is really important, and it'd be good to have this conversation with you, Kate. So a lot of times GPAs and certification tests are the criteria for entry, which we think are important. We also see in the research that they're insufficient and don't tell the full story. And as we study this in our teaching force, we see that just because you have a 3.5 GPA does not mean you're going to be an effective teacher and have strong outcomes. There is some correlation, but it is imperfect, I guess, as most things are in our lives. And so we believe that when we look holistically at a candidate, that's really important. We've studied our very, very best teachers in classrooms, and we see that other things also matter. Things like strong achievement and leadership matters. Things like being able to set a goal and actually stick with it through the challenges and get there. A deep belief in the potential of children, strong organization, strong critical thinking skills, strong interpersonal skills. All of these things matter. And so at TFA, we look at the wholeness of this as we think about admissions. Our floor is a 2.5 GPA. This last cohort that we just accepted had an average cohort of over 3.4 GPA. And so it's not compromising anything, but we see the whole thing. And when we do consider GPA, we don't look at the first and second year of a student's GPA, because especially as you're looking at first generation college graduates, which there's a disproportionate number of candidates of color who are first generation college graduate, they just take longer to get their feet under them and do less well in those first 2 years. So we look at the third, fourth, and fifth year and have actually studied, is there any difference if we look at all, the full GPA versus these last years in terms of student outcomes, and we don't see a difference, and think it's more honest about a student's academic performance and ability to do well in the classroom. So I'm anxious to talk more about this, but I'm going to stop right there. You go, Ken.
Thank you. So I think it's important for me to start by telling you where my perspective came from. I was a high school senior who thought that a whole bunch of adults were making decisions about kids without involving the student voice. So my buddies and we got me to run for local school board election, and I served as a local school board member. Then I went into school district experiences, school psychologist, assistant principal, district office, did that for about 15 years. And then I moved to the state education department in New York, did that for about 7 years during the Race to the Top time with David Steiner and John King. And now I'm at the state education department as commissioner in Rhode Island. And one of the things that followed me through that entire journey is the importance of voice and perspective, and how the interests of systems don't always align with the interests of the people our systems purport to serve, which includes not only our students, but also our teachers. When I think about shortage areas, I'm in Rhode Island most focused on 3 areas: career education teachers, teachers who support language acquisition in students who are acquiring a second language, and trying to shift that dynamic where we still view second language acquisition as a deficiency, as a drain on the system. I'm the one who's deficient because I'm not acquiring a second language. Our students who are acquiring a second language, they have a leg up on me and everyone else in this 21st century, and we have a tremendous shortage around English language learners. And then in this particular area around diversity, teachers of colors, there is a gaping hole in the soul and the effectiveness of our workforce until we take seriously the problems that are introduced by having these discrepancies between the teachers in our workforce and the communities they serve. And we have to pay attention to that. So I have some specific things that we're thinking about. First is we're thinking a lot about career pathways for students in general, and we introduced a pathway endorsement to our high school diploma requirements, something that goes on the transcript and on the diploma. And we're introducing 6 pathways, including teaching as a pathway. Until you start to talk to students about becoming a teacher in middle school and in high school, and until you start to give them experiences around the pedagogy, the content knowledge, and the practice of apprenticeships and internships with teaching while they're still in high school, not only is the best way to learn is to teach it to someone else, but the best way to think about enrolling in a profession is to do it. We have to have a pipeline strategy, and there is no way that we will tackle the diversity percentages that we spoke about earlier unless we start with a pipeline. Because our current model around credentialing, in my opinion, is just off. Yes, we need to have high standards, and yes, when we're going to implement standards, we have to do it in a high-quality way. And I'm the guy as senior deputy in New York who went to court to affirm New York's right to have a literacy test as part of a teacher credentialing process. Went to court. It was a court battle that went on for about 10 years, this idea that our teachers need to be literate. So I'm as invested as anyone else to have high standards for educators. But it is a gatekeeper model. It is a gatekeeper model. If you think about the gatekeepers, it starts in high school. So many of our people, our teachers, become teachers or don't become teachers because of the first part of our gatekeeping role, which is when they were in high school. Did you have a good experience in high school? Yes, no. Well, that puts you on the trajectory to either become or not become a teacher. And many of our underserved communities had horrible experiences in school, so why would they want to become teachers? That's the first gatekeeper. The second gatekeeper is college, and not just college enrollment, but college completion. And the numbers in college completion are abysmal. Then we get into teacher certification and all of the tests, and quite frankly, the more you know about assessments, and I've built assessments. I've built assessments in New York. I've built assessments in Rhode Island. And I sit on the National Assessment Governing Board that builds the NAEP. The more you know about assessments, the more humble you become about whether and when you should use those assessments to drive decisions that change people's lives. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means that you need to be very humble about how you do it. And we have a very front-loaded process around certifying teachers, which I just think needs to be balanced by a talent management process. If we spend as much time recruiting, inducting, supporting, and retaining our teachers as we do of putting them through this front-loaded gatekeeper process, we would have a lot better outcomes. So it just needs to be balanced, our front-load process versus a talent management pipeline. Also, we have to acknowledge that so many times when we credential people, Wall Street Journal just had an article about removing opportunity through excessive credentialing processes. So many times when we credential people, we tell ourselves it's about protecting the consumers, but it's often about protecting the people who currently are already in the club. And we have to acknowledge, anytime we talk about credentialing, we have to acknowledge that dual role that the credential serves. So here in Rhode Island, we're talking about alternative pathways. We're thinking about a lot about expertise, about how different areas of expertise can possibly balance against some of our traditional gatekeeper roles and how that will affect all of our shortage areas, including our diversity shortage area. And we can talk more about that in the discussion. The final piece I want to mention is around working conditions, because I think there's a tremendous amount of things we can do and we should do in policy and in practice around working conditions. The first is we don't pay attention to curriculum. We don't pay attention to curriculum. If you look at the secret sauce of Eva Moskowitz in New York City, the charter school network, they pay attention to curriculum. They do extensive and exhaustive work around developing curriculum with teachers, by teachers, for teachers, because we pretend that our teachers can be deliverers of instructions and scavengers of curriculum resources in the same breath. The night before, they go on Google, they go on Pinterest. We need to focus on supporting high-quality curriculum. If you want to do a single thing to affect equity of our student outcomes, focus on curriculum and the equity that's produced when we have high-quality curriculum available to our teachers, not to script our teachers, but to allow them to make the magic come alive in the classroom based on high-quality curriculum that's been endorsed by their peers. We don't pay attention to leadership. We don't invest in leadership. So many of the contracts that we have in our school districts aren't because unions are bad people. It's because they're responding to bad leadership. And contracts accrue like scar tissue. Remember that battle in 1972? Remember that battle in 1985? It accrues in the contract largely often because of bad leadership. We need to pay attention to bad leadership. We don't pay attention to professional development. 80%, 60%, 70% of our teachers tell us we should have saved our money on PD because we didn't involve their voice, we didn't involve relevance, we didn't do all of the things we know for kids, all of the things we know for preschoolers, all of the things we know for adults. We promptly forget when we do teacher PD. We do it to them instead of with them. We need to pay more attention to climate and culture because climate and culture is the engine that drives a good school to become a great school. Schools will never become great unless they have leaders that focus on building high-quality climate and cultures, and teachers will never want to work in those buildings unless they do that. Randy Weingarten talks about a school where teachers want to teach, families want to go, and students want to go. Now, if she stops there, we need to go much, much farther, but that matters. We need to focus on different ways to engage students, and the personalized learning work is promising, but it's also a huge risk. But we need to think about different ways to engage students, student-centered learning. And teachers want to change their roles. They want to engage with kids in different ways that properly leverage their expertise and their passion and their voice. So we can't do same old, the way we've always done things. And finally, we have to pay attention to the choice pressure on our district schools. The data are clear that when a district school has a choice pressure, we typically talk about school choice pressure. I also think course choice pressure is as important. And in Rhode Island, we have an advanced course network to bring nonprofits, private universities, other school districts to put course choice pressure. But the closer the pressure is to the school, the better the school gets. If the charter school is 2 miles down the road, the school has a bump, but not as big as if the charter school is 1 mile down the road, the bump is bigger. And when the charter school is co-located with the school, the bump is the biggest. We need to have that competitive pressure on our district schools, not to undermine our schools, but to make them better. We need to have a system for our own perpetual renewal. And teachers want to teach in great schools. So we have to pay attention to all of those working condition elements that make our schools great, and teachers will respond.
Thank you guys very much. All right, so I'm going to shoot a couple of rapid-fire questions at our panelists and then turn it over to you all to challenge and debate and question. All right, so let me address the first one to you teacher shortage deniers over here in the right side of the dais. So we don't have a huge deficit in the number of teachers generally who are being produced, but maybe teachers are fleeing for the exits, the incumbents, and so we've got a huge attrition program, and maybe, Dr. Goldhaber, you just didn't show us the slide that was going to show attrition going off the chart. What do you say to that?
I say, Drew, cue up the right slide. There is a slide that Dan is aware of that shows the attrition over time of teachers. And again, despite what you may read, attrition rates today are actually a little lower than they were a decade ago. They're a little higher than they were 20 years ago, but they float around, you know, the number of teachers that leave particular schools in every year. But if you read the headlines, it sounds like teachers are just running for the doors. And empirically, that is just not the case.
So there's this national myth that you have to ask yourself why it gained such currency. And I heard it said today that 50% of all teachers leave in 5 years. It's 17%. It's 17%. And I don't know how many times, you know, the 50% myth will not go away. But it's not true. It's 17%. And half of those are people who leave and come back because they're going on maternity leave or they're taking a break. But we have to, look, I think the teaching profession is in very poor health. But I think that we don't benefit the solutions by spouting a lot of data which just is not true.
I'm a national teacher shortage denier, but I am not a denier that there are problems that need to be addressed in the teacher labor market, and that if we don't get to the point of talking about what the real problems are, then we end up not solving these long-standing issues that you can trace back at least to the 80s when data starts to come online to make the case.
Like the need to pay math and science teachers a lot more money.
Yeah.
That seems like far too nuanced a point for the
Yes.
New York Times. I'm just going to say. So, Elisa, if I get this right, alternative certification as a whole, and Teach for America in particular, is producing a more diverse and more effective workforce than traditional programs. What is it that we need, and maybe you can start with this, Kate may want to jump in, Ken may want to jump in, Dan may want to jump in, all this. We haven't uttered a word that's an important word when we're talking about the teacher preparation, that's universities. So what is it that higher ed should be doing, and maybe they are doing in spots that would help both address these very real shortages in places like ESL and STEM and special ed, and also produce a more diverse workforce? What advice would you have both for our friends from higher ed and for folks in the audience who may be charged with regulating our universities?
Well, first, I would clarify and say that on average, I mean, there's hardly any difference, and maybe a slight difference is what this last report showed in terms of, you know, effectiveness. What I would say is, I think it's hugely helpful if we stop. It's not about who's winning or losing or better or worse. It's about being able to understand the product that we are producing. And so I would like to see us all be held accountable with real data that tracks to student outcomes in classrooms, holistic student, however people define that, that allows us, not as a punitive tool, but as a tool that where we are able to see like, wow, you all are producing this, you know, at TFA, we're proud that a third of our teachers are STEM, have a STEM background or teaching in STEM, but that we're able to then see where our weak spots are, because we have weak spots, and where our strengths are, so that we can do better. And and then we could all actually help each other, because if we saw others that say, wow, you guys are knocking it out of the ballpark there, let's go actually learn what you all are doing, and we could we could help others, and we could all sort of be working together to improve the whole. And so I would like us to stop saying like it's not about them or us or anyone being bad. It's about us figuring out what are the best solutions that are going to accelerate progress for children that have one shot at their grade that they're in right now, and we're fighting about who's better or worse. We're in this until it gets solved, and so it's a game that's going to last forever, and it's not about us or anyone else.
A basic piece of workforce development, and I spend a lot of time with my colleagues in workforce development doing this, is demand and employer demand. And we don't do that in teacher prep. Higher ed programs do it over here, and school districts do it over here. They need to be working together, starting with forecasting for who needs what, when and why, and so on, and also in terms of design. Part of it is driven by we don't have agreement on curriculum, So there's no agreement that ties together what the employers need their teachers to be prepared, day one preparedness, and what our higher ed partners are doing to make that happen. It has to happen through partnerships between the people who are hiring teachers and the people who are preparing teachers.
That, I have to chime in on
Yes,
university teacher
please.
prep, I'm sorry.
I'd be shocked. That might fall.
But, I mean, university, Ken hits the nail on the head. Districts like to grumble about the quality of new teachers that come to them, but they don't use any of their authority with teacher prep programs to say, if you send me 100 student teachers to place, and they're all elementary student teachers, I don't need elementary, I only want 5.
Yeah.
And if districts are willing to do that, which they're not, well, we're trying to get them there, then we could solve this problem in a few years. That's how quickly it would be solved, because universities would not allow people to pick elementary if they couldn't place them. If you wait until you need to hire them, that's too late. The university doesn't care, because 50% of all teacher candidates who leave a teacher prep program don't teach that next year. So that is not a black mark on the university as far as they're concerned. So the real leverage that districts have they're not using is at the point that student teachers are asked to be placed. But states have leverage too, and they're not using it. It's a much tougher sell. But states could say, you are an approved program, but we're not allowed to approve 500 candidates. You can prepare 100 in that area.
And a sort of a complementary point is that states or teacher education programs themselves could give people information about their labor market prospects. So again, as a particular example, in Washington State, if you look at people who do their student teaching and you look at the likelihood that they end up in the workforce 3 years later, if you got your credential in STEM, you're 50% more likely to show up in the workforce than if you get an elementary education certificate. I don't think that magnitude of difference is actually well understood by teacher candidates when they're deciding what they're going to emphasize. I'll say one more thing about teacher prep. I think that teacher prep is in a real bind, and it's not likely the people that we're talking that are maybe in this room. A lot of teacher prep programs, they are very reliant on the students that come in. I'm not talking about the flagship programs in the states. So I think I think they want to get better. When you talk to them, I believe that they want to get better, but they don't really have the tools to get better, and they've got these financial constraints that make it difficult for them to do things on their own. So I say at the very least, and this goes back to Kate's point about data, we ought to be establishing feedback loops, because there's a lot of evidence that there's more variation in the quality of teachers within teacher prep programs than there is between them. And that kind of argues for figuring out what are the experiences or what are the attributes of the teacher candidates themselves that's leading people to become effective teachers down the line, rather than saying we have to close X, Y, and Z programs because you're going to likely get rid of lots of effective teachers as well as ineffective teachers if you make sort of that wholesale change.
So let me follow up on that for a second about higher education. I was reading an interesting data point the other day. Often when you talk about the lack of diversity, particularly in university-based teacher prep programs, what you hear is, gosh, there just aren't enough college graduates or even undergraduates of color. It turns out that university teacher prep programs are recruiting a lower percentage of college graduates of color than of white graduates. So this is part of the reason, if you forecast going forward, this gap that you see is going to get wider in terms of the makeup of the workforce versus the makeup of our students. So let me ask you very directly, how and why is that going to change among higher ed? What is the combination of different regulatory policy or incentives or change from within that are going to change these things that you guys are talking about?
there are simple, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
There are simple demographics working against us. The adult population is much less diverse than the children's population, the kid population is right now. I think it's like 80 to 60%. So right down in there, the odds are stacked against us. But a big problem with diversity is a lot of minority college goers are first generation or do not come from particularly affluent backgrounds. And so they have huge student loans. Another thing that legislatures could do is to do some loan forgiveness for minority candidates, because that is a great stumbling block to their consideration. But that doesn't take away my primary point, is that we are turning away talent of all colors because they do not see teaching as a high status proposition. And especially if you're a first generation college goer, you're anxious to prove your mettle.
What does it cost to become a certified teacher in Rhode Island or New York, Ken? Give or take. So if you're
I don't think as much. You mean to go to undergraduate program?
Alt-cert
full-on.
varies dramatically. It could cost you $2,500 and it could cost like $20,000. And so this is a huge problem, actually. When you're talking about affordability, you know, we face this all of the time, where our first, as you say, disproportionately college graduates are first generation college graduates. So if you have a loan, on average, it's about $30,000 that you have to figure out how to pay back. There's so many pressures for first generation college graduates to have economic stability, to figure out how to pay the loans back, to support their families, and it's really a losing proposition. And so we've got to get creative, to the points that you were alluding to, Kate, on how to do this. So it does, we see that as a huge barrier, and we're part of AmeriCorps, so we get a stipend that they're actually able to use, and it's a huge thing for us. It ends up being $10,000 over 2 years, that a lot of our folks.
But we are paying a fortune to get teachers.
But even just the cost of the credentialing process, you know, hundreds of dollars. And to Kate's point before about reciprocity and the lack of willingness of reciprocity, to me just shows some of the hubris of us. Like, we in Rhode Island hold our noses. We won't accept the cut scores in Massachusetts. You know, Massachusetts is recognized as an international leader in education, and we're arguing about 2 or 3 cut scores in this test or that test. So when we have a teacher who wants to work in Rhode Island from Massachusetts, we make them take more tests, a couple $100, and they often balk at it, and they don't do it. And we don't even know about the people who never come to talk to us. So I'm working with my team, and part of this work is convincing your team that you're not insane and that you want to do these kinds of things. We're going to just surrender. We're just going to announce unilateral reciprocity that we'll take from our neighbors in Massachusetts and our neighbors in Connecticut. We'll take their certified teachers. And that in itself will capture the imagination of the public, of the employers, of the higher ed, and immediately we will have a greater pool of candidates which will benefit our schools. Because we just get this thing like the teachers aren't out there. That's garbage. They are out there. We have to produce more of them. We have to find them. We have to entice them to come into the profession.
And you make a teaching credential more valuable. So it's not just at the right now that you'll have a greater pool to draw from, but hopefully, I mean, I think that's brilliant. I'm glad to hear you say that you're doing that. But like, think about the people who are thinking about becoming a teacher, but they're not sure that they want to live in Massachusetts or Rhode Island or Connecticut, right? This gives a great deal more flexibility for your future residents.
One of the most interesting pieces of research that came out this year was a study of districts that are along a border of a state and how they have a much harder time filling vacancies than districts that where the state surrounds them. And the reason is they've cut off a whole bunch of teachers that live within 25-mile circumference of them that can't get a job with them. So right then and there is hard evidence that states are shooting themselves in the foot, making it so hard for somebody to cross a line. Kids are the same. Kids in Minnesota learn math the same way the kids in Wisconsin do. And
I don't know about that.
Well, maybe not.
So I'm going to ask one more question. So if you guys have a question, you can start coming up to the mic, and I'll turn it over to you in just a minute or two. So my final question is around rural communities. And we talk about this issue of teacher preparation, recruitment, and shortage as if it is one issue across the entire country. Of course, we know communities are different. Elisa, you run many programs in rural communities. Ken, you're responsible for rural communities and were when you were in New York. What are the particular challenges, if any, around rural communities and recruiting and retaining teachers, and what are the promising practices to address those?
So what's most top of mind for us is hard to staff subject areas like the advanced sciences, the advanced math, rural communities that just may not be able to keep the staff in place. We have some certification requirements around, specifically in the sciences and the languages, that tend to get in the way of keeping those hard to staff areas. And I think the solutions need to be the kinds of things that Kate talked about, but also virtual learning opportunities where you can create partnerships to straddle those labor shortages.
One thing I would say is, I mean, I think this is a growing issue. 7 out of 10 states have populations of 28% or greater that are serving rural communities. The population is in rural communities, and so this is a real issue. And I think STEM is obviously the biggest shortage area we see in rural communities, and so we see some innovative things like in Mississippi where they will have interest-free loans, for example, for teachers that are being certified and teachers teaching in certain subject areas, i.e. STEM, to make it just easier. And we are observing more of our own rural communities that are also focused on just the economic opportunity and knowing that we have to provide more opportunities for kids to want to stay and then attract kids that grew up there. And so we have some interesting alumni working on innovations where they're trying to figure out what are the biggest problems in our community and how can we create more economic opportunity. Even things like coding and access to the internet, because folks can do that from rural communities. And so we're seeing this great project in New Mexico on the Navajo Nation where this is happening, and kids are being trained to do this and able to do coding for Albuquerque, but stay in their own Navajo nations where it's hard for them to have mobility.
That's right. Dan, did you want to?
Yeah, so teacher labor markets are super localized. And we don't know whether that's because of the preferences of the employer, that they want to hire people who grew up around, the school system, or the preferences of the employee. But what we do know is that if you do your student teaching in a school, you're much more likely to end up in that school or school system. And so when this comes back to this issue of the feedback loops that I was talking about, so if you look at states, we don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me because I see it in Washington State. There's a hole in the middle of the state that is the rural school districts, and those are the school districts that are having a real difficulty recruiting teachers. They're also the school districts that don't typically host student teachers. So when I talk to those superintendents, the first thing I asked is, are you hosting your student teachers? Because as Kate suggested, the teacher education programs need you. They need to get their teacher candidates student teaching experiences before those people can be credentialed. So I think that that's an area where you could get a real solution. I want to just advertise something I forgot to say. We keep talking about how the labor markets are, we shouldn't talk generically about teachers. I forgot to mention that if you go to the Calder Center website, you can click and look at the number of teachers that are produced in different areas in your state. Because again, it varies across the entire country what the shortages look like.
The most underutilized solution to so many problems with teacher supply and demand is the student-teaching partnership. Yep. And it's more complicated than we have time to get into today. Happy to, if anyone wants to write me, this is the work NCTQ is most focused on, is fixing student teaching instead of running to residencies, which costs on average $65,000 a candidate exclusive of salary. Yep. We have to fix student teaching, and it's possible to do so.
I have one other word to add to that, paraprofessionals, but that's all I'm going to say. Okay, so please step up, give us your name and organization, give us your question. I'm going to ask the panelists, because we want to get in all of these questions, there may be more, to be really informative and really concise.
Oh, we're going to be very short.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Beryl Amade, State Representative from Louisiana. I have two questions.
I think the student population stayed relatively stable. I'd have to look at the graph. It may have declined slightly, but I think it's pretty stable. It's the number of teachers that has skyrocketed.
Yes, and do you have an explanation for that, or?
Class size.
Class size.
That's it?
Also special education.
Special ed.
the
I don't know
models
if that's
have
the
changed.
reason for the past 4 years. It is the reason for the past 30 years, but I don't know if this latest jump is that. I don't know.
This
But I
is a
could look into-
long-term trend, so overall spending control for inflation on K-12 education has increased markedly in the last 40 and 50 years, and the lion's share of that increased spending has gone into the workforce, expanding the teacher workforce. We will get you those citations that Lisa was mentioning.
It's Thomas D. that's done most of the work, DEE. Anyone else?
But we'll
And
see us
many
after, we'll
others
definitely get you
are
those
studying
citations.
this, yeah. Yeah.
What about the minority teachers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Jack Howard, I'm here with the Office of Research and Education Accountability with the Clinton Comptroller. Thank you guys for coming out today. So one of the most interesting things I heard you discuss was the idea that districts can act as gatekeepers and really kind of control, the certifications that are coming from these EPPs. And I'd be interested to hear from all of the panelists on how you think that might interact with some of these really important topics. We've also discussed about attracting teachers that share socioeconomic and racial backgrounds with their students, and also the idea that EPP entry-level requirements need to stay high at the same time. Thank you.
That's
Boy,
going to be a
that's a
tough one to be
mouthful.
concise on. But
I'm going to say very quickly, I'm working with an anonymous school district. I'm going to keep it anonymous given what I'm about to say. And I said exactly this to them. They wanted to change student teaching in ways that I think made a lot of sense. And the teacher education programs pushed back. And the issue was that I was like, what are you afraid of? Like, they need you, right? And they were afraid that the college presidents would call the superintendents and be angry. So I think that there needs to be kind of a push from somewhere else, state, whatnot, that makes that adult conversation a lot safer.
No. We got an answer to that.
It's
So what you do is you don't say no that year. You say, I'm putting you on notice if I still have my job. In 2 years, when you come to me with this many candidates, I'm not going to be able to place them. They've already accepted those candidates, so you can't be mean.
Yeah.
You're going to get in trouble. But you got to do it the softer way.
It's hard to do, though. District leaders are overwhelmed, just like most folks in public sector. You have to do it together. So unless it's a very large district, you have to do it together. So you have to work with your colleagues, other superintendents, for example. And it has to be anchored in data. If you don't have good forecast data, then you need good forecast data. And you have to question, why aren't you investing in good forecast data? And anchor these no's in the data. We don't need these teachers. We need these teachers for certification areas, demographic areas, whatever. If you anchor it in data, it's really hard to get ideological.
Yeah, exactly.
And honestly, if there was a demand for more diverse teachers, where it's like, we need this, you can do it. You would just get creative. At TFA, we just decided we had to have a breakthrough. We put the resources, we put the focus. Every single one of my recruiters has a goal on the percentage of people they're meeting that are people of color to build the pipeline. On admissions, none of that is considered. But we see if you built the pipeline, you produce what you need. And so there just has to be a demand for it, and people have to figure it out.
terrific.
There's a way
Thank
to do
you.
it.
Yes, sir.
My name is James Weisberg. I'm the CEO of Basketball Letter. And so my question is, I think we all hear the same story that their teachers go out of pocket, and 99% of teachers spend about $500 out of their own pocket. And so one, just the mere fact that that happens has created a perception of teaching as some sort of sub-profession. What other profession or what is requiring candidates to go in knowing very well they're going to have to spend their own money to do their job? And is there anything going on to sort of address this systemic problem?
Yeah. So
That's number one. And then number two,
So on your wallet question, procurement is one of those issues that is incredibly impactful for all levels of government, whether it be district levels or state level, and very rarely gets the attention that it needs. And what I mean by procurement is centralized procurement processes. So state officials making procurement decisions, superintendents, even school principals. Part of the problem that I called out before around teacher professional development is teachers, in effect, are not making their own procurement decisions about their own professional learning. They're relying on the procurement decisions of someone else who typically does it as an afterthought. Same thing with the supplies. There is absolutely no reason, and we've been talking to philanthropic organizations about doing teacher wallet research for quite some time. There's absolutely no reason why you can't take the overall school or district budget, divide it up, and give teacher procurement authority under certain thresholds consistent with certain standards and guidelines. There's absolutely no reason other than legacy bureaucratic reasons.
Just to add to that, one of the things Michelle Rhee did when she became chancellor in DC was to say to teachers, if you need supplies, anything, you call this number, we'll get them to you. They didn't go broke. Great, thank you very much. Let's get to the next question.
Thank you very much. Donna Johnson with the State Board of Education in Delaware. And one of the things that you talked about very early on really spoke to me. In Delaware, we have invested over the last several years in really improving our teacher prep programs, our licensure certification. So when we address the problem of reciprocity, knowing that in our state, we require performance assessments, we have content readiness assessments, we have a great deal of mentoring and changes in our student teaching that could be residencies and much longer times in other states. How do we address that concern of reciprocity without feeling like we've lowered our standards?
Well, what we recommend to states is that you require evidence of effectiveness in the previous state. That's of mixed use these days because people aren't taking new evaluation systems as seriously as we thought they should. If you have testing standards and the previous state doesn't have any testing standards, you do want to administer a test. But what you want to get rid of is, what's most important are these transcript reviews and the coursework requirements. Ken's talking about the couple $100 I may have to shell out for a new test. I think the bigger problem is, one, they can't get through to anyone on the phone at the State Department of Ed, and then when they do get on, they're told they have to take 5 courses. I mean, and there's always these funny stories about a guy who taught a music class, was told he had to take that class before he was allowed to get it, that kind of stuff. So I think it's the coursework that is the real problem.
Yeah, and I would just urge us to focus on, as you're alluding to, the outcomes. Like, what data do we have and that's more important than the inputs once you actually have evidence of performance.
But we need to keep in mind, sometimes we get so focused on small risks that we actually create large risks. You're talking about just looking at the pool of potential people who could be hired. It's still on the school district whether or not they hire people, and just because someone is in their pool, because there's reciprocity, does not mean they should be hired. So the balance that we have to ask ourselves is whether overly onerous reciprocity rules are actually creating a bigger risk that we don't have a pool of candidates from which to consider that might actually enhance our workforce.
Thank you. Let's get these last 2 questions in.
Hello, I'm Chair of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. First of all, thank you for this incredibly thought-provoking conversation. What struck me in thinking back to the session title, Teacher Shortage Act or NED, was that we've heard from you a lot about the numbers, the size of the teaching workforce and how that's grown over time, numbers related to teacher preparation and teacher attrition, but we haven't heard about
Who's got a quick answer on that one?
To
This
me,
is
the
a small
biggest
question.
I mean, we saw what happened when we led with individual teacher evaluation conversations for the past 5-6 years. We saw what happened, and some of it was really, really good, some of it was really, really ugly, and some of it was really, in my opinion, really, really bad. Ultimately, the accountability for the quality of instruction is through our accountability structures with schools and districts. And if we have authentic, effective, meaningful, impactful accountability structures, there will be a real incentive to not put a bad teacher in front of kids.
There are two ways to improve teacher quality in the United States that are going to have the highest impact. First, change how we prepare them, and second, change how we pay them. That's what I've learned after 15 years.
And third, change who the them is. So Ellen and I had a conversation this morning, but I'll say this to the rest of you. Like, I think the other thing is we need to be more skilled at figuring out how to use, within school systems, use human capital systems smartly. So I think Washington, D.C., everybody ought to be looking at what's going on in Washington, D.C., because I think the impact system is very good at human capital at all stages, and that some of what they do is figure out which teachers they want to keep and which teachers probably they shouldn't.
It's amazing what's going on in D.C. I don't know why people aren't lining up.
They also invest a lot in professional development. So it's like a combination of all these things, and there is no silver bullet, sadly.
Thank you. Yes, sir. You've been so patient.
So, would you say we have a shortage of teachers of quality?
The answer to that is a resounding yes. The answer to that is a resounding yes. Yes, sir. Thank you for waiting.
No, I'm going to go home.
I'm going to be a little politically incorrect here, but tacitly in all of your comments is the legitimacy of teacher certification. And I think there's enough data out there to support the contention that being certified is not necessarily indicative of being qualified.
Mm-hmm.
So
Totally.
the question I have for each of you is, why can't we get rid of certification laws? And by doing so, create certification as a result of proven ability to have children learn under your care, so that you get certification after you start teaching, not before.
Singing your tune, Dan.
Yes. And you're not a plant.
which
I just
Dan?
want you to certify right now that you're not my plant. Okay. Yeah.
My name is Don Nielsen. I'm with the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington.
Thank you so much. Okay, so
Can I just say, I think you're right that certification is not a guarantee of quality. That does not mean, however, that getting rid of certification would not have a deleterious effect on the quality of the teacher workforce, because we don't know the counterfactual, because we can't tell how much of the attributes of the people who are in the workforce today have to do with the individuals and what they brought when they entered a program versus the training that they get while in the program. And unless you could parse those two things out, you wouldn't know what the implications would be of just wholesale doing away with certification.
A colleague on the dais would argue with that.
I don't think so, but let's see.
You talking to me?
Yeah.
Let me just say, I don't think education is served well by blowing anything up. We don't need to blow up any more things. We need to improve things. And there's a lot to improve around teacher certification, and I agree with you 100% that we need to move out of our legacy practices around teacher certification. But the only thing we'll get from just blowing up systems is just more people laughing at us.
There are some interesting frameworks that, I think are interesting in Minnesota. For example, there's like a tiered licensure process where in your first year, all teachers get lots of supports, have to show certain level of proficiency in order to enter the next, stage of licensure, and then the next stage. And there's a way to hold accountable trying to get results. And I think there's creative things that we should be trying and innovating on as we go forward.
I was going to say, I totally agreed with you 20 years ago. I totally agreed with you 20 years ago. And then I started looking at all the different things that teachers, if they knew, would make them more effective. Yeah. And it started with reading, and it extended to elementary math and instructional strategy and classroom management. And before you know it, there's a body of work and knowledge. They're not delivered in most education programs, granted, but if it were, we would have a more effective teaching force.
And I would say net certification is a negative, because it creates a barrier to entry that it does screen out some people who would not be effective teachers, but it screens out a lot of people who would. And that's a problem right now that our kids need. Okay, so I want to just say one thing. If you have follow-up questions, I want to say on behalf of my great panelists, all of whom I know and all of whom are extraordinarily generous, if you are working on this issue back in your state, district, region, please call on us to help you if we can provide any help. Join me in thanking our panel. They were terrific. Thank you so much.